Sounds good. Hey guys, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Michal. I appreciate it. Hello, my name is Andy Kruspe. For those of you who don't know me, I am a percussion instructor from Huntsville, Alabama. I work with high school drum lines. I run my own teaching studio. I play with several bands, and I also promote folk music concerts. Back in November last year, Michal had sent me a message on WhatsApp and asked if I would give this presentation about the latest developments in bodhran technique, and as you can see, I agreed to this presentation. However, when I started asking myself, what are the latest developments in bodhran technique, I was pretty intimidated by the question. And the biggest intimidation I had is I want to make sure, I understand we're kind of at the center of the bodhran universe right now, and I want to make sure that everything I'm going to tell you all is as accurate as it possibly could be. So it feels like it's a little bit of a weight. So like I said, I want to be accurate. I'm a bit of a nerd about this subject in general, so I really had no idea how I was going to go about answering this question. And after a bit of time, I settled on these things. So I want to break this presentation into some questions and kind of tell you what I thought about before I actually give you some answers. So first is, what do we mean by technique? Second is, is it how we hit the drum? Is it how we voice the drum, or is it something else completely? So I think when I talk about the answer to the first question, it's what we do ultimately to produce the sounds that we want to hear in order to best accompany the music that we are playing. And ultimately the sounds that we want the audience to hear when we are playing this music as well. Now with regards to the last three questions, I think the answer to all these questions is yes, of course it's how we hit the drum. Yes, of course it's how we voice the drum. But then that idea is it something else? Stick a pin in that. I'm going to come to that in just a second. So, because the idea is that some of the stuff as far as the technique, what we do to produce the sounds we want to get, especially over the last 10 years, are not always how we hit it or how we voice it. So, moving on from there. To go about answering these questions, I also wanted to kind of define a time frame for this, because if I were to say between now and the end of Fenton Valley's lecture in 1960, that'd be a really easy question to answer. Obviously, a lot has changed since Kiltor Coolin. So what I wanted to do is basically choose a time frame. The time frame that I chose was roughly 2018 until now, as compared to about 2010 to 2020. And I know that these dates overlap, but when you're looking at kind of like an evolution of anything, is that hard and fast start and stop dates don't always exist. There's a little bit of overlap or dovetailing with things. So the resources that I use for this, as far as going about answering the question within this time frame, is let me go back to that one. Is a lot of interviews, a lot of audio analysis, a lot of listening recordings. I did over 8.5 hours of interviews with various people asking about their perspective on this. I analyzed drum solos from approximately 2010 until now, listened to a lot of recordings, I listened to recent albums. I actually charted when I was looking at various Irish festivals across the world, what bands featured bands that were like bodhran forward, and just try to see all I could possibly see in terms of audio, video, audio being like maybe just listening from the audience, stuff that's on YouTube, but also actual albums that made it to the market, so to speak. Those are all the resources I use to go for this. Now, as far as the latest in developed bodhran technique, here's where I'm going to start with this. Overall, I don't think much has happened at all. You can see the asterisk down there. There are some exceptions, and I guess one of the good things about trying to be honest and as fair as I can with this presentation, kind of treat it like academic pursuit, is to a degree, whether your thesis succeeds or fails, there's value in studying that and looking in that. And like I said, I wouldn't have come to this conclusion had I not asked people like Eamon Murray, Cormac Byrne, Colin Phelan, Robbie Walsh. So it's like, folks giving answers back is like, I think that I can be a little comfortable in saying those words. But the second thing is like where we talk about that other thing, the other ways in which we produce the sound, the other, not hitting, not voicing, the use of expanded hybrid kits. And what I mean by expanded hybrid kit is basically using the bodhran as the center of something that we would commonly recognize as a drum set. So the idea is where the bodhran is kind of the primary voice and you expand it with various foot percussion and other instruments that you can hit with the tipper of your hand. That's what I mean, I think, where the advance or the change in how we produce the sounds occurred. The other thing that I think is a really fascinating thing, and it's really kind of breaking edge it right now, is using the bodhran as a device to interact with electronics. And that doesn't mean just like with a loop pedal, but actually interacting with things like pitch shifting devices, time shifting devices, using it as a MIDI controller, using a combination of a sensor and a microphone to put it into a computer, and the computer actually interacts with what you're doing. I'll get to more about that in just a second. But before we actually start talking about some of the latest developments, I think it's fair, and I would argue absolutely necessary, to talk about some of the trends that have happened in this time frame. So, because all this development doesn't necessarily happen in a bubble. So one of the couple things I want to mention is this, is that one, educational materials, especially since 2000, is if you look at what we had from approximately prior to 2010, which is my first Craiceann, and after 2010, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I think it's pretty representative. Is if you look at the stuff when I started coming to Craiceann and getting ready for it, all the stuff that's on the left side were some of the regular things that you could do to get bodhran instruction. When you look at the stuff that's on the right, again, you can see it's extremely expanded. And the thing I would argue is that obviously the content has gotten greater, but two, I would argue that the quality has gotten much greater. Some of the tutors and instruction and things that are coming out now are much more informative, easy to understand, easy to access from people of all kinds of levels. The other thing I think is a third thing that's important to notice is kind of the modalities of how we learn. Is if you look approximately around 2000 to 2010, books and videos, obviously that's an obvious one. So then you have the workshops. When you start going into the other 2010 till now, especially with YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all these kind of like other media platforms, that you start to see all these other really high quality, valuable resources. I know Eamon has a Patreon, I know Paul McClure has a Patreon, is that you can access data and information with sight and sound in ways now that you could not do from 2010 and earlier. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Which, by the way, talking about YouTube videos and stuff, is one thing I thought about this when I was analyzing YouTube videos is we owe this guy a huge debt of gratitude. He's sitting still and filming right now, but the thing I argue, and I was like, I bought him a pint last night, and so should you. But the thing I thought was interesting about him is when I went back to start looking at the media to analyze the things that we through the timeline, a lot of it happened on the stage, and we could see that thing because of Hinnerk's work or all the work he's done with various concerts throughout Germany and other places he's been. I really want to know what his work looks like in 30 years. Because if you think 30 years earlier from now, you're talking 1994, think about the media that we have available to us now is not in the format or quantity or content that we have today for this stuff. So 30 years from this, man, this is going to be, I would argue it's going to be archival. So anyway, next thing I want to kind of point out is also the platforming of and exposure to more female drummers. Is because in the last, in this time as well, we're seeing more and more great female drummers in teaching and playing. And in comparison to Craiceann's, my first year, Siobhan O'Donnell and Amy Farrell-Courtney were my teachers here. But then you look at Craiceann's here, is that we've added Neve Fennell, Caitlin Corrigan. Siobhan, she's not teaching, but she's coming as a performer, and Amy Farrell-Courtney is also here as well. Would also say there's also increased visibility of other female players, especially over the last 10 years, and some of them even came through this very stage and building, like Kara Wildman, Amy Richter, who's now Amy Pennington, Anna Colleton, Nicole Figg, Michelle Hedden, Izzy Donnery, Lily Butler, Kathy Kirk, Marissa Wade, just to name a few. And I gotta give props to Madeline Hurt, because when she was doing her Fanny Power blogspot, is reading about all this stuff and trying to see other things to understand. Again, just another great resource space. I think it's important to acknowledge that. I'd also say with all the folks I was interviewing with in order to get the answers I'm going to give you, Colin Phelan was brought this as like, in light of the fair play movement and stuff like that, this is probably something you should acknowledge, and I absolutely agree with him. So the other thing I'd also mention, is also development of drums and tippers. Is that the drums, when I first started, I think this was Christian Hevicek started coming out with this original MOS, but back before that, if you're going back to 2000, the start of Craiceann, probably the gold standards of the drum back then were the Seamus O'Kane and the Charlie Burns. But you look at what we have available to us now, we have so many more. Tippers, drums, skins, tuning systems, mounting systems, shell designs. It's just nuts the amount of stuff that we have right now. And also when you talk about synthetics, don't shoot me. But I will say inevitably that month and a half before Craiceann stuff gets spicy online. Yeah. So I will say that with this, in the worlds that I live in normally, which would be marching percussion in America, concert percussion in America, world percussion in America, and drum set in America, we saw this larger trend of going to natural animal skin heads, and now pretty much everything that I use is synthetic. So to kind of borrow from a quote is like, that the arc of percussion development is long, but it bends towards synthetics. I think to a degree there's some truth to that. I will always definitely think though that there's gonna be a home for animal skin and stuff like that, just because my main drum's animal, but because I live in Alabama and I have this thing called heat and humidity, I have to have a synthetic on standby. But anyway, just wanna give a note towards that. The other thing I also want to note is that kind of the raising of the standard, because especially talking with various people throughout my interviews, they talk about what students were like around 2000, around 2010, and clearly the younger players are doing more than I ever could when I first picked up the drum. In short, the kids are all right. Yeah. So kind of a thing. And I think that's due to teachers, to media, to all the stuff, to this interest, to us exactly like here, saying come to Craiceann, go take lessons, go to FLAs, go to workshops. So again, the floor now is completely raised from the start of the time period I'm talking about. Second thing I also want to talk about is the ratatouille idea. The idea is that and I apologize, this might buffer in just a second, but if y'all ever seen that Pixar film Ratatouille, where Anton Ego's giving his final soliloquy about his review of when this rat actually made Ratatouille, for those of you who've seen the movie, I just want to play this line and let this sit in your ear for a second. So.
Not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere.
So the idea is not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere. When I started looking at getting really geeky about bodhran in 2010, obviously it seems like all roads led to Ireland. That's not the case anymore. So it seems like this drum is really starting to spread to other places. Real great players are coming from other places. The other thing I'd also note is kind of this diaspora of the drum, is that the drum now, obviously we know it in the context of Irish traditional music. I think like, if you look at, say, for example, the work that Cormac Byrne has done with chamber orchestra stuff, especially with the King of Ghosts that he did with Shamik Dada, or Amy Farrell Courtney with her orchestral work, or even the stuff that I do at home, man. I have taught in the last year alone bodhran with drum corps, marching band, concert band, chamber percussion ensembles, percussion on recitals, and right now, sometimes I don't like to say this, bluegrass jams. And the reason why I say I don't like to say this is because it's just like where I live, especially in North Alabama, very strong home to bluegrass and old time music. I feel more welcome and more comfortable at times taking a bodhran to a bluegrass jam than I do sometimes taking to an Irish session. Think about that. So that's just so those ideas, like I said, trends that kind of led up to this. So now getting into those ideas, latest developments in bodhran technique. This gets me to the kind of the heart of the topic at hand. And like I said, I just want to take a classic approach to this. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you what I just told you. So now I'm getting to the tell you part of this phrase, of this thing. So the first thing I want to say is when considering how we hit the drum, I think not all that much at all. And I need to qualify this real quick. So like as I said earlier, I did a fair amount of watching and analyzing the solos of several players that we all revere. And I figured that if I was going to find a development or a trend or something different, it was going to be in the drum solos of all the people that we put on a pedestal. And then with that, apologize, get back to my notes here real quick. What I'm about to say is not a criticism or a pejorative, but in so many of the solos that I saw, almost the same solo that I watched in about 2000 to 2013 was almost the same solo that I saw from 2021 through approximately 2023. So and I'm careful about this because I notice even some things is like, man, I'm noticing too many similarities. And I'd even take photos or notes of like, watch one run of the solo. This happened at this timestamp. This happened at this timestamp. Formal analysis. Here's what it's doing. Here's the technique they're using. And I was like, all right, I see the ends. I put in between. And a lot of occasions I found, man, the form stayed the same. The timestamp stayed the same. The technique stayed the same. And I'm not going to mention names or solos because, like I said, some of these players are friends of mine. I like them. I still revere them. I just don't want it to be confused with me saying that a solo really didn't change or technique didn't change over like a 14-year period as a criticism or a pejorative. It just a lot of the stuff, I didn't see anything go, oh my gosh, this is new. This is different. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So now with that too, like I said, no shade, but I do want to offer some thoughts with what I just said. Is that, and this is the on the board, there's some things I want to talk about Eamon Murray and Colin Phelan with regards to this. about the idea of a hybridized roll. And when I explain what I mean by that is, traditionally we understand the different ways we can do rolls or ornaments, or may sometimes be called triplets are either kind of that double-ended version, is where you go down, back, up, so we're going, or that single-ended where all the speed and the action is coming from the front end of the tipper. So it's always kind of been split to one of those two ways. But back in 2015, Eamon started teaching this, and these are my notes from 2016, is where Eamon started to teach his version of this 5-stroke roll. We'd go tap, down, back, up, tap. Digga-digga-da, digga-digga-da. And then, I'm not sure if you thought, and I should say that this is my terminology and analysis. I don't want to put words into your mouth. This is just somebody looking from the outside of it. But the thing that I thought fascinating about this is when you look at that 5-stroke roll, da, 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 tap, down, back, up, down, is that what he did is if the distance between all of those notes is the same interval, it's the same timing, digga-digga-da, nothing stretches or opens, da-da-digga-da, or da-da-digga-da, it's all the same interval between the notes. And the interesting thing about that, I would argue, is that the tap down, that's technically single stroke technique. But the down back up is double-ended technique. So in that 5-note figure, it's like, man, you're really getting a double or single-ended overlapping with the double-ended, and that creates a hybridized roll. So I think you're starting to find a way where it's either I either play single-ended or double-ended. I would argue that's maybe not the case anymore. But like I said, if this is kind of the latest developments of technique, and I thought, man, I'm onto something. I think I got it. So when I ended up doing this presentation, I ended up recording I'll get this in just a second. Sorry, I got a slide ahead of me. Tell you what, show you what he's doing. Colum did this as well, and this is the video from this stage right here exactly a year ago from Hinnerk's work. So what I want to do is I'm going to play this portion of the solo, and I'm going to explain what Colum's doing real quick. Right there. Right there. Right there. So what he's doing there is it just like, it just feels like there's all these notes in there, what's going on. And it's not, I didn't ask Colin for this, I just used YouTube's slow down to 25%. And what he's doing is fascinating, because he's going, and it's kind of an extension to what Eamon was talking about earlier, he's going down, up, down, back, up, up for the first part of that. He's actually doing a quintuplet, a fivelet, da-ga-da-ga-da-da, opportunity bop. But then what he's doing is he's chaining 2 of those fivelets together. Sorry. There we go, chain 2 of those fivelets together. But he's putting them in the framework of da-ga-da-da-ga-da-da-ga-da. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1. Opportunity, opportunity, baka-ba. And it comes out as a grouping of 5, a grouping of 5, a last part of 2 to get him back to the downbeat. So, but however, when you look at how he's doing that, it's going down, up, down, back, up. But if you look at the down, up, down, technically that's single-ended. If you look at the down, back, up, technically that's double-ended. So he's actually fusing the 2 together to get a fivelet, a quintuplet that he chains together and puts into it. And I was like, all right, that's where I need to plant my flag. That's the new technique. And then when I started talking to Eamon, that confirmed yesterday, and when Colin called me back, he said, we've actually been messing around with this since we were boys in about 2005, 2006. So I was like, I don't know. But I think then you talk about the development, because again, some of this stuff overlaps, so it's way older than we think it is. I got first exposed to it in 2015, 2016, thanks to Eamon, but they said, man, we're just like kids messing around in 2005, 2006. So the idea is, I think what I'd argue is the advancement is, I think, 1, now, especially after this presentation, the awareness of it, and 2, is start maybe seeing a pedagogy or teaching structures to start teaching this kind of thing out there. The other thing I should mention too is that this is kind of a late note that I added actually yesterday morning. Cormac Byrne called me, he said hello. Is what I tried to do with it, what I did with this presentation is I put it all together, I recorded me giving it on Zoom, and I sent Zoom links out to everybody that I interviewed and said, would you please listen to this and make sure the stuff that you told me is being fairly and accurately represented with what you told me. And I got I got much more positive information back. There's some corrections I had to make, but one of the corrections that Cormac made, he's been on tour, he hasn't really had a chance to watch it, hence the late note. I'm going to read right down from this because this wasn't rehearsed in the presentation. As I said, did several interviews for this project and then video recorded, sent to all of y'all. He says hello. He had mentioned that some of the sticking patterns that Ronan O'Snoddy used, especially in some of those black and white videos that you would have seen in and around the pandemic, particularly where he's doing it in a reel, down, down, up, down, down, up, or that jig pattern he uses, down, up, down, up, he would say those are not common either. You would at least want to mention them. Like I said, trying to give you the best information, so that information came late, even though it's not integrated in the presentation. I just want to get it out there. So if somebody can counter me, and by all means, if you can, do, because I think the cool thing about this is to start a conversation. This doesn't have to be definitive. So anyway, I just want to add that. So the idea is that some of the sticking that Ronan O'Snoddy does is a little bit more unique. So now to the next one. So anyway, so that's the idea of the hybrid roles. But the other thing I also want to mention too is the idea of friction as a production of sound. It wasn't a bunch of stuff, but I saw it as like, okay, this jumped out and this was unique, this was different. Is that whenever you've seen Robbie Walsh's solo from approximately 2016, 2017 timeframe till now, he did it on this stage once, and I think the first time he did it, the video started showing up with him doing it in a pub. He rubs the tipper against the skin, so the actual sound is happening from friction, not a strike. And let me show you what this sounds like. And all he's doing is just scratching the drum really quick. And he had struck the drum once, and he's starting to voice it. So again, I have to admit it, or that I wanted to add it just because, hey, that's unique, it stuck out. But the one thing it also did remind me of that I think is fair is, have any of you ever heard of Big Jim Sutherland, drummer with the Easy Club? He's known for using that big double-ended brushy tipper, and a characteristic of his sound was that scratchy brushiness. So I'd say, he didn't do exactly this, but there's elements of what I heard in what Jim Sutherland's sound was. I think it's at least fair to acknowledge that, to see that kind of through line backwards. All right, now, with regards to voicing, I want to add one more thought from Colin Phelan, because like I said with technique, it's how we hit the drum, but it's how we voice the drum. Is one of the things he said was this, paraphrased, he says that players are much more conscientious regarding the use of the tone hand now, or at least in his opinion. He also credits this to the work of teachers such as Jim Higgins and Brian Morrissey. And with this, he also said that in his opinion, between like 2000 and 2010, the tipping hand was kind of in a little bit of a technique race. Is who could get the faster rhythms out, the cooler things out, and hence mentioning earlier some of the stuff that Eamon and Colin did with regards to getting to what I would analyze or consider a hybridized role. And he thinks that a lot more is going on with the tone hand today. Younger players are starting to use more of that mid-range of the drum and play a little more sensitively, a little more finesse. In short, he just feels like that the idea is that the voicing hand is caught up with the tipping hand. So if the decade of the tipping hand was 2000 to 2010, the voicing hand is from 2000 to 2020, and now we're kind of meeting and converging. It's catching up with all the things the drum can do. Now, getting into that next one, latest developments around technique, other. That's that third question. Is it something other than how we hit the drum or how we voice the drum? So getting into this question regarding that, is it something else? I think that in short, these acoustic hybrid kits, and again, Bodhrán players have been augmenting their setups for way longer than the time frame that I gave you. Just to give some examples, players have been using stomp boxes or tambourines or other instruments for at least the last 20 years. Some examples might be, I remember talking to Alfonso in 2005, and he described to me of a drum kit he made out of Bodhrans. So I guess technically it's a Bodhrán, technically it's much more of that. I just put out there because it's a curiosity. But players such as Jackie Moran from BUA, from Chicago, Illinois, USA, have been using things like hi-hats and a Bodhrán as a bass drum at least as far back as 2008. And I'm sure there are many other players, again, augmenting what they do with their feet, with their hands. It's not an uncommon thing. Now, the distinction I want to make with this is, again, is that substantial incorporation of the Bodhrán into what we would commonly know or recognize as a drum kit. Does that make sense? So now, to give some examples of this, probably the most prolific practitioner of this is Cormac Byrne. So the photo that you see here, photo user permission, is that he bases a lot of this stuff based around the Bodhrán itself. You can see that he's sitting on a cajon. He has on his feet a hi-hat and a pandero and some other shakers and things he can add. He controls the bass drum with his right foot, and then he has another snare, a tom, a bucket, and various cymbals around him. So the idea, the bodhran becomes the center of his universe, but he takes that kind of drum kit around it and expands it a whole bunch more. To show you what that sounds like kind of in a context, this is him with the group Rototrad at the Göttingen Music Festival. This is probably, the reason I know it's in 2012, it's the clearest example I can give. So what was going on with that is he was controlling the bass drum with the foot, adding other percussion with it, and then as it goes on, again, I want to go a little quicker, but he would hit cymbals, hit toms, expand what he's doing. It's not just feet and this, it's many other things. Another example of this, like I mentioned earlier, is he did this with Shamik Dada, the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, with the piece King of Ghosts. If you're not familiar with it, it's a chamber orchestra with percussion with a sarod player, and they do a soundtrack to a black and white movie up behind it. It's absolutely fascinating. But he's doing the same thing here, same idea, but in a slightly different context, not traditional music or traditional adjacent music. So again, and I couldn't get the exact one he was reaching out hitting. Certain audio examples had it, but he was, again, using this stuff in more of the context of a larger drum kit. So now, the next thing I also want to add to kind of more modern examples, Evan Carson, he's doing the same thing. So what you're going to see here, he's got snare drum, tom, cymbals, and then a bass drum and a hi-hat that's got the goat's hooves shell pods on it, and this is what he's doing. The playback is electronic, but all the sounds are like a mini kit with it. What he's doing with his right leg is when he did that figure, because he can't hit the bass drum, he's backing it up with the bass drum so you can hear the explosive crash, but you still get that low end punch with that combination of sounds. So you can see the bass drum beater in the back. No, we're not going to watch that video. So the other example, for those of you who are familiar with the musical Come From Away, about all the aircraft that were stranded in, was it Nova Scotia, I think it was?
Yeah.
Okay, say it one more time?
Newfoundland.
Sorry, Newfoundland. Oh, sorry, we're from
Newfoundland.
yeah. So in Newfoundland is that Steve Holloway, one of the road percussionists of this, started doing the same thing as well, just to kind of show you his integration. And the thing that I like that I thought was really interesting, instead of just actually hitting cymbals, and I've seen Cormac do this as well, he does this cool figure on the hi-hat, which in America we would call heritas, because it sounds like herita, herita, da da da. And he's actually doing bodhran technique, changing the angle, going digga da digga da 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 on the hi-hat and then going back to the drum. This is, again, another example of that integration. But again, just example. Now here's the stuff that starts to get me excited, because the guy's sitting right here is the first example of it. The idea of an electroacoustic hybrid kit. So the idea, instead of just using acoustic percussion instruments like you saw here, is this integration of various electronic instruments with the acoustic instruments to give you a certain sound palette. So with this, Eamon Murray. So what he's got going on here, and you can correct me because I didn't realize you'd be sitting right there. So he has a hi-hat, a crash cymbal, a snare, and a little farmer foot drum kick drum. But then also integrated into everything he uses around here is off on the right-hand side of the picture, you see that device that says Roland. It's a Roland SPDSX drum machine, and below it on a tray he has a sequencer. So he's triggering various electronic effects real time, and also having other things going behind it. out of the Roland, and in various videos that I've seen him use, he'll attach it to a kick pedal, so it makes like a Roland 808 or other kind of bass drum sound. One of those other chords are going out. If you look at the photo on the right, do you see that gray rubberized chunk that's hooked on the bottom outer quadrant of his bodhrán? That's a bar trigger. So what he does is he'll play the bodhrán, reach forward, hit that bar trigger, and it triggers a snare drum sound. So when you're in the audience, what you're hearing is an amalgamation of the acoustic soundscape and an electronic soundscape all at once. And especially with that snare drum, so we is that correct?
Yeah.
Yep. So, and give an example of what you're going to see. I'm going to advance it to the next video. Is you're going to hear this kind of drum setty groove, but he's playing bodhrán with it. And again, part of the sound is acoustic, part of the sound is electronic. And I think this is really interesting, creative interleavening or overlapping of these ideas. So what you get is this. That's absolutely fascinating because it's like me teaching marching band, we do a lot of incorporation of electronics with acoustic instruments as well. So when I started, and I think you remember like when I was asking questions about it, I was like, it's this and this. He's like, yes, it's this. And so it really dealt with a lot of the stuff that I do when I'm teaching high school kids in America. The other guy who does a lot of stuff that's very similar to this is Dermot Sheedy from Hermitage Green. So if you've ever seen Hermitage Green play, this is a setup of him. And by the way, absolute special thanks to him. When I interviewed him and asked him questions, the next day, this is in February, he's like, I think like February 10th and 11th, he goes, I'm going into the studio, do you want to make me a video? And he made me a track-by-track breakdown video explaining everything that he does. And you see him hold the microphone, he's actually, okay, Andy, here's what I'm using, here's what I'm doing. So absolute props to him. I can't thank him enough to help me kind of, opening the curtain and showing me the man behind the curtain side of the thing. So what's going on here is if you look from kind of the bottom to the screen up towards the top, towards his left leg, he has a kick controller that's controlling a synthetic bass drum sound from the drum machine. Then he has an acoustic kick sound, which is that kick pedal, which is that red bass drum he's playing. Over the bass drum, various crash cymbal voices. He has a snare drum in the center, a hi-hat off the top, and then on his far left, where his hand is that red Roland SPD-SX. He can also have off of his left foot, there's a hi-hat pedal, and then where his foot right now is on a trigger pedal. So he can trigger tambourine or other sounds other than just that hi-hat. So what he's doing is he's moving his feet, depending on where he's playing, what he's doing, but it's all based around what the bodhrán is, where the bodhrán is leading the tune. What that ends up sounding like is like this. And again, special thanks to Dermot Sheedy for making this video for me. So right now that was acoustic bass, synthetic backbeat, acoustic hi-hat. I'm not quite sure where it's right, but so anyway, he's again that integration of what we consider bodhrán with electronics with acoustic drum sets. So that's what I mean by like an electronic hybrid acoustic kit. But then also yours truly. So for about 90% of the gigs that I do is either in bluegrass or bluegrass adjacent music. A lot of the times it's brushes, a lot of the times it's just snare drum and bass drum. What I use in this context is this. Between the snare drum, hi-hat, and the bass drum's only 14 inches. It's absolutely adorable. It's so small. But then I'll use a small hi-hat, small cymbal, small ride cymbal, wind chimes, a bodhrán over there on the left. The bodhrán, when it's mic'd up, gets plugged into that red device that's just to the upper right of the throne. That's a loop pedal, and then the pedal that's off onto the side of it is a slave pedal because I can program my looper to get a fourth and a fifth function separate from what the three main pedals are. And what I try to do is I'll record myself making loops and then play to it. I can start, stop, and advance depending on the songs that we're doing. And then the stuff that's on the side, that's a Roland SP404s, depending on the tune, like if it's something that's sad or whatever, I need a drone, I just hit a drone that will like fill out the room and excite the subwoofers and go back to playing. But what I'll do is it goes back and forth between bodhran to hi-hat to bass drum to other instruments around me. And just to kind of give a little example of how I control the electronics, do all those other things around it, this is from an EP I recorded last summer with a band I play with called the Cold Turkeys. It's a John Prine cover of a song called Spanish Pipe Dream. So the shaker's going. Breaks the tool. I'm going to let it play through this phrase real quick because there's a hard stop, and what I'm actually doing in addition to playing this over the shaker is I stop it right away so it's there's an orchestration to it. So the next thing I want to get into is that, but also the bodhran is a device to interact with electronics. And I say interact with because there's a bunch of things that go on, and I kind of want to trace back to like what exactly that means. The first example I want to give here is this guy. You all know him? What was it, about 4 or 5 years ago, he started messing around with this device, which is called a Macmillan Instruments bot pad. Is what it is, it's a MIDI controller. If you hit it by itself, it makes pretty much no sound. As you can see, it's divided into quadrants, and each of the quadrants will send a separate signal to a computer through a USB cable. And when you hit those different quadrants, you can program, I want this one to sound like a bass drum, I want this one to sound like a snare drum, I want this one to sound like a hi-hat, I want this one to sound like a tom. And for Martin, it was just kind of like experimental. He just wanted to see what happened with this. So what this looks and sound like, he's playing this electronic percussion controller with bodhran technique. And then so basically, he's not making the sound, but when he hits, it tells computer, play bass drum, computer plays bass drum. Or hits it at a different area, computer plays snare drum, computer plays snare drum. He's just triggering a sound using bodhran technique on a percussion controller. So then he started messing around. Well, if this were to interface with the bodhran, is then he did a version of it where he put a device inside his drum. So again, it's just he's just doing using bodhran technique on a controller, but again, the sound already exists. He's hitting it, and the computer's just like, aye, aye, sir, I'll go ahead and play the sound. So then the next one I want to talk about is kind of like you input sound. So he's just inputting signal, what Martin was doing. But then there's another way to do this where you actually input sound, and then the computer realizes what you're going to do. I think the best demonstration of this is this software Voclia. Is what it does is it like, this lady can sing into a microphone, but then it goes, she's actually singing pitch and dynamics and different note values and certain inflections. It goes into a computer. The computer says, I want to hear what you're doing, but assign that voice to a cello. So that way, it's like when you hear just the naked ear, you hear a human being singing, it sounds gorgeous. When you then shut off the volume of the microphone and you get the output of the computer, you're getting something completely different, but it's still sound as an input as opposed to signal and striking as an input. You just kind of, you're going to hear some singing where a guy's singing, but it comes out as a different one. The second one is a guy beatboxing. You can hear him beatboxing, but then you're going to see like these crossfaders that hear his voice versus the output of the computer. It'll show you exactly what's going on. Just voice. That's the voice taken out of the signal, but again, the sound is the input. So basically what the computer is reading, frequency, volume, different parameters, and say every time he goes, The bass computer goes, all right, bass drum, boom. But you can still hear, that sounds like beatboxing, but it's just coming out of speakers in a different way. So now where I think that this is interesting is Evan Carson, and I apologize, I don't have media from him on this yet because this is that new. So that what he's doing is, he said he's attaching like different sensors to the bodhrán and different microphones to the bodhrán all at once, and then can set parameters and programming so that like he wants to shut the system off, he can just play the drum. If he wants to turn the system on, he can then program parts of what he's doing that is if he plays a certain pitch on the drum, it triggers a sound. If he plays soft, nothing happens, but if he gets above a certain volume threshold or something like that, and again, these are possible things he can do it, it's just like he can interact with the limitations of programming he said, so you can get an acoustic and an electronic picture, but it's a lot more interactive than just go boom. So one of the things he told me now too is he's using this Evans sensory percussion. For those of you who are not aware of what it is, it's a clip-on sensor that mounts to the drum and measures volume, where you're playing, how you're playing, touch. It's all these different parameters that weren't previously available to us as percussionists with regards to what electronic signal can be turned into various areas of sound. But then we said, yeah, we're experimenting with this. I got a question for you real quick because I know what those sensors look like. Does that mean that you're Frankensteining these sensors or kind of messing things around with to make it work with your drum? And he's like, and I think that's fascinating. So the idea is that, again, this is where it's like where sound from the bodhrán along the signal becomes a way that you can manipulate those sounds and create, like I said, technique, the sounds that you want to make in order to best accompany your music. So the next one after that, Dave Boyd, if you're familiar with him. So Dave Boyd, talking and asking what he does is he uses, like I said, bodhrán as a way to interact with percussion or interact with electronics. The first one is I hit device, it makes sound. The second one was I make sound, sound makes other things happen. But now this thing you're going to see is him messing with various glitch filters and ideas. Is that if I put input, I expect something to come right back right away, whether it's signal or whether it's sound. He's actually interacting with something that happens on a irregular interval or in different ways. So when he hits the drum, whatever is supposed to happen may not happen right away. It could be sooner, it could be later, so that it's like somewhat irregular. And then when it happens, he can interact with that and it creates something that's kind of more interactive with the electronics as opposed to scripted with the electronics. Does that make sense? So what that looks and sounds like is like this. So in short, like he would play a figure on the bodhrán, and the effector, it'd be like something like diggity-da, but you'd hear, and then like, bless you, a little while later it'd come diggity-da, irregular intervals. He's interacting with what he's doing as opposed to just triggering or using sound or signal triggers. Does that make sense? So when I say bodhrán interacting with electronics, that's a bunch of things happening, various things that make that happen. Bless you. So now, closing thoughts on this. Is where are we going? I think it's exciting. I think it's awesome, but I also have to say one of the concerns I have in America teaching percussion, especially at the marching band level, is because we sometimes overdo things. And I'll let the laughter settle. But one of the things I'm concerned with percussion instruction, I know I have a couple of folks and new friends and old friends around here, is in order to do these cooler things, it means you have the budget to do cooler things, which means that you suddenly turn the field into have and have-nots. And I'm concerned about that because I don't want a child or a student or a community to not have a music educational experience just because they can't afford it. I don't think that's right. And I started seeing, oh, this stuff is cool. Oh no. And just like wondering, is this going to start moving into this world? And I don't think so, because as long as workshops like this happen, session culture happens, certain festivals happen, I think it's going to be, it's going to be okay. But we're also going to have people like Eamon, like Cormac, like Evan, like all these people, because just like the idea is like, I want to try something new, let's go with it. I think that's going to happen, but they're going to just like, they're going to exist together. It's going to be awesome. You can do it on stage, but then you also grab the drum and head to a session. So I think it's going to keep moving forward, but I think that where we are, I don't think it's going to change. I think it's going to stay the same. The other thing I want to add too is counter trends is I was asking, I think Eamon, Cormac, and Dermot is like, well, do you use this a lot? He goes, no, it's highly contextual. Like for Eamon, say he only uses it with Bioga. Dermot Sheedy said he only uses it with Hermitage Green, and there's a video of him floating around playing with Shiva, the vocalist, recently. It was just him with just the drums. It's like, oh, okay, he can live in all these worlds together, which means he's not a drummer, he's not a baron player, he's a musician. So the idea is that it's the sounds that he wants, and he can use. Y'all can use this just wherever it's needed, and that these kind of cooler things are only in the context of certain scenarios, only at certain times. So I would say a counter trend is like maybe kind of going back to the old way of things. Maybe, I don't know. I still have some thoughts on that. I don't know what to say about it yet. I'm still thinking about it, so I apologize on my answer right now. The other thing I would also say, one thing I want to mention, Cormac, when he's talking about with me, I said going back to nothing, just the drum. Cormac was clear, wanted to make a distinction with him, his clarity, make sure you know this is, when he plays the drum, he often uses a foot pandero. If you've ever seen him playing, especially he's done it with the har, he's done it on this stage in various situations. And I said, well, that's extra percussion. He goes, yes, but the reason why I use it is because remember, barons used to have jingles. So if he's playing baron and you hear that pandero, a jingle instrument, to him that's a connection to older ways of playing the drum. So it's just that that's where his thoughts coming from. The other thing also, closing thought from Cormac Byrne and Robbie Walsh on this. So I know Robbie couldn't be here, but he kind of is. So this is really geeky and this is really specific, but also this is kind of like a little bit of navel gazing. This is like getting absolutely geeked out about something like in the grand scheme of things. It's like, I'm sure that as you guys are having pints and playing a session later on, it's like, that's a cool presentation, but you're not going to be thinking about it tonight. And that's okay. It's just people getting really, really geeked out about specific things. So one of the things that I think that it's neat to look at this. I need to see the things that are happening, but shouldn't get so geeked out about it that you see miss cool things like sessions and simpler things kind of like that. Just don't get too detail oriented. Cormac had shared the thought that from his viewpoint, the drum really hasn't made up its mind on what it wants to be yet. and I think that's fascinating because, again, you start seeing this in so many other contexts and stuff like this, and to get to that idea as well, is like I said earlier, we're kind of in the center of the baron universe right now, and I make the argument is especially for this workshop for the last 10 to 20 years, has been so many ideas that were formed here and then went back out to the winds and came back. This has kind of been like a catalyst or a hub for some of the cool things we ultimately saw, and I just think it's neat. I know it has been where I live and with the people I teach. But I want to leave one quote from Robbie Walsh real quick. Just talking about, yes, even though we can geek out about this stuff, remember the world at large, a lot of them still don't know what it is that we do or what we're excited about. So I'm going to play this quote from him real quick.
Here's the thing, Andy. We're very, very lucky in the timeline that we live in Barrow now, because we haven't hit the stage where everybody knows what it is yet. So a lot of the gigs, I'd say, 80-90% of the gigs that I do, a lot of people are like, what instrument are you even playing? Like, what is that? And then when I do, like, what the? Great, which is great. So it makes it at the moment to be at the level that we're all at in our baron playing, in our style of playing, just in the level that we're at in standard wise, I'd say, is great because it means we always get that reaction everywhere we go, which is fantastic, where you could be playing to a lot of trad musicians and do that stuff and it'll just go.
So that was kind of like the final thought he gave. I think about that. Just again, remember, even though we're all excited about this and we're all really into this stuff, a lot of the folks around us in our home community still don't even know what the heck this thing is. So anyway, I just want to leave just a couple of things at the end. This acknowledgement of the sources I had as far as this: Dave Boyd, Cormac Byrne, Evan Carson, Junior Davey, Kyle Forstoff, Christian Hedvichak, Karen Leonard, Eamon Murray, Colin Phelan, Dermot Sheedy, Rolf Weigels, and Robbie Walsh. And the Kraken crew: Michal Holland, Katrina O'Holland, Cormac O'Holland, Dermot O'Holland, Gary Fortune, Rolf Weigels, and David Lewis. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions real quick? Yes, in the back.
What role do you see AI playing?
AI?
Yeah.
Whoa. Man, I saw how that stuff was supposed to help me out with my flights with Aer Lingus on Saturday. I'm gonna tell you. I'll reserve comment. So, any other questions? Well, is this good? You happy? Good.
Am I happy?
So, guys.
Say that there's no other man in the world, in the universe, that could do that sort of analysis of what he just did there. Awesome.
Cormac Byrne.
The amount of work he put into that, and it's just incredible. Thank you very much. That was just amazing.